the big idea is, first of all, the opportunity cost, right? So that's what he really pushes a lot. When we think about costs, we shouldn't just think about historical accounting costs. We should think about opportunity costs of not, if we're doing X, we yield Y, and the net benefit of not doing Y, that's another cost to us that we should also internalize. What's the difference between average cost, variable, fixed cost? So we just did that. So he talks about that in the chapter, but we just did this in the problem. Average cost is the sum of fixed costs and variable costs allocated over a number of units. And you need to be and we need to be mindful of using it. Define contribution margin. Contribution margin is the revenue per unit minus the variable cost per unit. So that's the idea is that you shouldn't be selling or producing anything unless you have positive contribution margin. And that's something you should have learned at some point, either in the undergrad or, I mean, he talks through the chapter. What is the cost volume profit analysis and what are the elements of that? So cost volume profit analysis is the idea, is the break-even analysis. And that if trying to figure out algebraically the quantity to at least break even, meaning to have zero profit and a non-negative profit, right? And the basic outcome of that process is that if you have a linear cost structure and for a single product firm, so it's very limited in that sense. The break-even quantity is the ratio of fixed costs to contribution margin. The limitations are given by how it's defined. It only works for a single, for a single product firm. It assumes costs are constant. It assumes prices are not affected by costs and vice versa. They're independent of each other. He has a whole discussion on that, in the book. What is operating leverage? Why is it important for financial statement analysis and predicting future performance? So this is the idea that higher fixed cost companies, meaning they have more variable performance. Remember, in the long run, you still need to recover fixed costs to be profitable. I mean, So what happens with high, and so the operating leverage is the proportion, is the ratio of your fixed cost to total cost. So the more fixed costs, the more costs are fixed, that basically the more you have to incur no matter what the volume is, right? So in other words, if you are a purely variable-driven company, variable cost-driven company, in other words, if you produce, you incur the cost. If you don't produce, you don't incur the cost. So if there's no demand for your product, for companies with low operating leverage, where fixed costs are low, well, they just cut the production levels, they're not losing money. But for companies with high operating leverage, if the production goes down, if the demand for products goes down, they still have to eat their fixed costs, and so their performance suffers. That's on the downside. On the upside, fixed cost companies, high fixed cost companies actually tend to do better because they can spread out, the high demand for their products allows them to spread out the average costs over a larger number of units. So that's why in the good times, high capital intensive companies tend to do better, and in the bad times, they tend to do worse. So that also means that their performance is going to be more variable over time. There's going to be more volatility. Companies that have higher operating leverage have more volatile earnings. Differentiate between period and product costs. The period costs will be things like SG&A, selling and general administrative expenses that are not directly traceable to individual products. that you manufacture. Product costs are the costs of producing something: direct material, direct labor, direct manufacturing overhead. You know, the costs that were incurred to produce the goods or to deliver services that are directly traceable to the companies. Differentiate between direct and indirect costs, variable and fixed costs, and indirect overhead costs. So you have direct costs that you know directly. Okay, this table, when there's wood that I need, that there's metal, there's somebody made it, so there's direct labor. But there's also indirect costs. Well, this table was produced in a factory that also produces a bunch of other things. They use the machine that used to produce a bunch of other things. There's a supervisor, there's a foreman on the floor that supervises a bunch of other products. So it's not, you can't directly trace, but you know, to this particular table, this cost, but they're still there as part of production of those costs. So then this indirect costs, which is typically the overhead costs. So the other term for indirect costs is the overhead. They need to be allocated somehow to, you know, to the units produced. And that's one of the objectives of management accounting, is to find out ways of allocation that are not distortionary or least distortionary, because it's kind of a judgment call. And it's actually a problem, right? So for instance, in a university, right, when you're trying to decide, there's three, you know, the colleges, engineering, business school, arts and science, whatever, law school, and each one of them are profit centers. But besides them, there's a library, there's the provost office, there's the president's office, and those units, they exist for the benefit of those other colleges. But it's very hard to judge. Well, you know, how should you allocate costs of library between different schools if they service all of them? And then, so then you need to make some assumptions about it. And depending on how you make those assumptions, it could really affect those schools' bottom line, right? So for instance, I might make an argument that, well, my business school students don't really use the library too much. I'm being facetious. Why should we eat some of that allocation? And so schools oftentimes, for that reason, want to play a game with those allocations, because, you know, it could make them better or worse. So that's one of the key areas that management accounting and management control systems tries to deal with. And so within that realm, you know, direct or indirect costs, they could also be fixed or variable. So you need to think about how to allocate those as well. So that's what chapter 2 is about. Any questions or comments or thoughts on that?